to start our next unit looking at the civil rights movement to start. And things are going to be a little bit disjointed in terms of the timeline, but I am going to give you everything that you need and hopefully everything will fit together. So we're going to start here. Throughout these slides specifically and over the next couple of days, we're going to describe the processes that led to the expansion of rights for African Americans, describe methods that civil rights activists used to protest segregation. Today we're going to look specifically at segregation in schools, and identify leaders and groups that influenced the civil rights movement. So a little bit of a reminder, because this is important in terms of what we're going to be talking about. In 1896, the Supreme Court decided in a case called Plessy v. Ferguson, this was a long time ago now that we looked at this, that it was constitutional for state law to require racial segregation in public facilities or amenities as long as the facilities or amenities were separate but equal. The vote was 7-1 in favor, and that will remain the norm, the status quo, until the Supreme Court case that we're going to look at today. So what is discrimination? What is segregation? I think we covered this before, but it's always worth covering again and delving into a deeper understanding. Discrimination happens when one group is treated differently from another based on their being a part of a different group. Segregation happens when one group is kept separate from another group. And both of these happen when there's prejudice or intolerance. And you may remember that we talked about de facto and de jure segregation. Here we're going to be looking at de jure, meaning it is written into the law for things to be the way they are. So here we see an example of separate but equal facilities. It's a drinking fountain. One is labeled white. One is labeled colored. Now you can see clearly that they're separate, but I think it's pretty hard to argue that they're equal. The white one has a filter and a cooling system, so you get cold, fresh water. The colored fountain is just a plain water fountain, and you can see it doesn't look super clean. It hasn't been maintained. So the idea here is that it is separate, but in the way that this separateness is created, it's not equal. Here's another example for colored only, and I know you know from reading To Kill a Mockingbird or other things that you've studied that what were called at this time colored people were not allowed to share the same facilities, like in the courtroom, right, in To Kill a Mockingbird, or movie theaters. And here we have a couple different examples. But the main one, and probably the most important one, would be schools. Schools were segregated based on race. There were white schools and there were black schools. And there's a slew of different reasons why: funding and tax revenue, all of those things, redlining, all of that comes into play. We're not going to delve really deep into that. I hope it's something that you take an interest in, and I would love to give you some resources to dive a little deeper. But here we are with 8 days left. So on the left-hand side is a white high school auditorium in a town in Virginia. These are from 1951. And then on the left, as you're looking at the screen, on the left is the white school, and on the right is the black school. So they're separate, clearly, but the auditoriums are obviously very different. You can see at the Moton High School that they're folding chairs where they are auditorium chairs at Farmville. And we'll look at a couple of different examples so you can just see they are separate, but are they really equal? Here's another example, same schools, same place in Virginia, 1951, the facility from the outside. So what does separate but equal look like? Well, it looks like this. And I have a bunch of different images here from a different slideshow, which is why the formatting looks different. But I want you just to take a couple of minutes here on your own time and just look at these images. So you can give me a pause take a look at the images to hopefully get a better understanding of what separate but equal looks like. And it isn't just segregation that's based on colored versus white. There's all kinds of ways that issues of prejudice and discrimination play in. So we're going to look at the case that's going to change the status quo from separate but equal under Plessy v. Ferguson. And that case is called Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, 1954. But before we quite get there, we need to start at the beginning. So in Topeka, Kansas in 1952, Oliver Brown files a class action suit, which is when you sue a whole group as one entity, against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas on behalf of his daughter, Linda Brown. She was denied entrance into Topeka's all-white elementary schools because she was not white. Brown claims that black schools are not equal to white schools and that is a violation of her constitutional rights for equal protection under the law per the 14th Amendment. It goes up to the district court, and the district court rules that segregation in public schools has, quote, a detrimental effect upon colored children, that it contributes to a sense of inferiority, but they are still going to uphold that separate but equal is fine under the law. So they're recognizing here that there's something about separate but equal that isn't actually equal, but they're not quite willing to rock the boat. Now, once a case gets to that point, it can be packaged with other cases and brought to the Supreme Court, or it can just move as its own independent case to the Supreme Court. In this case, there are about 4 other cases about segregation in schools. They're going to be packaged together and labeled together as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And by 1954, it's brought before the Supreme Court. When it's brought before the Supreme Court, you have to have a lawyer. And their lawyer is going to be a man by the name of Thurgood Marshall. At this time, he is the head of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And he has been fighting the good fight all across the country, using the courts to try to dismantle this system of discrimination and racism within the American justice system. And he will become their chief attorney. He will later be appointed to the Supreme Court by President Lyndon B. Johnson, and he will be the first Black Supreme Court justice. During Black History Month, he was on my door because he's such an important figure in the legal system, but also in this push. So at the time that the case was coming, there's about 2 years of lag time. The Chief Justice at that time had held that Plessy should stand, and he had basically said, like, you can bring it to the Supreme Court, but I'm telling you what we're going to find. He died and was replaced by President Eisenhower, because that's how Supreme Court justices work. He's replaced by Earl Warren, and Warren is going to push the Supreme Court in a very different direction than it has. There's a whole period called the Warren Court, in which all kinds of civil rights legislation is pushed through. So you'll hear his name again. Warren wrote, "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place, as segregated schools are inherently unequal." Inherently means, like, at its core, by its nature, it is inherent to the reality of the situation that it is unequal. So as a result, they ruled that Linda Brown and the other plaintiffs that their cases had been packaged with her case had been deprived of equal protection under the law. So they found that Plessy v. Ferguson, and you may remember this from way back when, was actually in violation of the 14th Amendment. So I have some images for you. This is a great unit in terms of what we're able to do with photography, and I'm really excited to give you all these images. So here's Linda Brown and her mom. High Court bans segregation in public schools. These are some of the counter protesters. You can take a look at them and the signs that they are holding. Stop race mixing. That was a really hot topic, I guess, at the time. Instead of calling it integration or an end of segregation, people who were opposed to integration called it race mixing, that the races were meant to be separated. So they're not going to make so much of a legal argument. They're going to make this argument that it seems to be just based in fear. Here we see some NAACP signs. We protest school segregation. And then this little girl here, her name is Ruby Bridges. She was a first grader at a school in Louisiana, and she was the only black student in the school. You can see here that she's being escorted to and from school by law enforcement. And that's going to come back in just a second. So the results of Brown versus Board of Education were positive. I mean, obviously, we want to see things integrated, but the court can't legislate how to integrate schools. They can just say it's unconstitutional not to integrate schools. So a lot of places just didn't integrate because they were opposed to race mixing. So an example of where this bubbles over is in Little Rock, Arkansas, 1957. And the group becomes known as the Little Rock Nine. They are 9 black students, and they are attempting to attend Little Rock Central High School. There's really no legal standing to stop them, but the community as a whole, as you can see in the image, was very opposed to these 9 black students joining this school. The governor of Arkansas, and yes, this is his real name, and this is not a joke, Orval Faubus, used his power as governor to deploy the National Guard to prevent these 9 high school students from entering the school building. President Eisenhower has no time for this, and he uses his power to deploy federal troops, and they are escorted under armed guard to and from school. So here is an image of soldiers actually armed and in uniform and doing the whole soldier thing, marching these students to and from school to protect them. I have a couple of different instances here. So this is also in 1957. This is in Nashville, Tennessee. It is a grammar school that was bombed because it was one of the schools in Nashville that was integrating students at the first grade level. First grade classroom that was bombed because people were opposed to integration. This image I think is really powerful because when you first look at it, it looks like it could just be any classroom in the 1950s. She's got the cute hair scarf, she's got the bun, she's got the blouse, and it all looks very Grease until you look a little bit closer. So this is also in Tennessee. This is 1956. She is being physically segregated within the same classroom. She's separated by empty desks. You can see that they've created this kind of perimeter behind her, around her. Students are not allowed to sit near her. She's seated in the back by the door. And if you take a look, her desk is different too. At this time, there were 12 African American students attending this school, and there had been similar issues of violence like what we see in Little Rock before the school was fully integrated. Before we just fully move on, and you're going to look at some primary source documents today, looking at the 14th Amendment and the Brown v. Board of Education results, I just want to take a little bit of time to give a little bit of review. The Civil War amendments, slavery, citizenship, and voting. And these are going to come back throughout our understanding of the civil rights movement, because just because these things were outlawed, slavery was outlawed, all citizens are guaranteed equal protection under the law, regardless of previous condition of servitude, and then states can't deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Just because that's what the court had said doesn't mean that that's the reality of the situation. And Jim Crow laws are a part of why that is. There is, if you look on the left of your screen, there are some examples of Jim Crow laws from a couple of different places. If you look at the one from Arkansas, I think it's 1903. It shall be unlawful for any white prisoner to be handcuffed or otherwise chained or tied to a Negro prisoner. No colored barber shall serve as a barber to white women or girls. That's specific actually to Atlanta. Marriages are void if one person is a white person and the other is possessed of 1/8 or more Negro, Japanese, or Chinese blood. And that's in Nebraska in 1911. And we're actually, in this next 2 slides from now, I'll come back to that idea of marriage. So Jim Crow laws, they were discriminatory laws, and the civil rights movement is what's pushing back against them. There's a lot of organization that goes into this, and that's something that we will look at in more detail on our next Civil Rights Day. However, here's a couple of important Supreme Court cases, and I've included this here because the last time that I taught this unit, this movie had just come out in 2017. And it's called Loving because it's actually Loving versus Virginia. It was a Supreme Court case that provided that state law cannot prevent interracial marriage. At the time, interracial marriage was labeled under the law as miscegenation, which has to do with like a sullying of the bloodline. So again, based on racism, prejudice. Brown versus Board of Education is here. And then Bailey v. Patterson is what will undo the rest of Plessy v. Ferguson, which is transportation facilities like bus and train stations. But note the date on that because we're going to look at busing in a little bit more detail and see how that played out maybe a little bit differently. But you all already know that transportation was desegregated through the actions of many people throughout the South, including Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin in the 1950s. So you're going to move on from here to looking at your primary sources for the day, and I will catch you later.